Welcome back to Soft Cover at ThePrint. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm here today with Mr. Roger Faligot, who is the author of a fantastic book on Chinese spies. Firstly, Mr. Faligot, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
This book has been available in French for a long time. The Indian edition's just come out. And I have to say, it is one of the most granular, detailed looks at the world of Chinese spycraft, Chinese intelligence, an area about which regrettably little work has taken place. So thank you again for joining us. My first question, really, to start at the end of your book, if I may. We've had a lot of discussions over the last couple of years about the evolution of Chinese espionage, particularly into the cyber domain, the emergence of Chinese spycraft as one of the most powerful forces in the world today. How serious do you believe the threat from Chinese espionage to major Western countries and to countries like India is today? Is China of the same order of threat as the Soviet Union was during the Cold War? Or is it a more powerful actor?
Always difficult to say exactly, but you're right to compare USSR and present-day China. In fact, until the 1980s, last century, the Chinese had what I would call a regional intelligence community. Spying mostly around themselves on the borders. Of course, India was one of the great targets at the time already, but they were very limited. At the same time, after the end of Cold War, at least after 1991, in fact, the Soviet intelligence community was weakened, as you know, and for about 12 to 15 years, it was not as big as it used to be. And during that time, the Chinese did increase their power, their ability to organize themselves in many ways. Well, as you know, first of all, for economic reasons. And the president of the time, Mr. Deng Xiaoping, and after Mr. Jiang Zemin, organized a huge intelligence, I would say, economic intelligence community with various agencies, and extremely widespread. And at the same time, they organized a major military revamped, if you want, organization as far as spying goes. For instance, they had several different agencies belonging to the People's Liberation Army, the PLA. They were prior to that period, they were involved in, as you say, in India, in Japan, against Taiwan, obviously, trying to take over Hong Kong, which unfortunately they have succeeded now. They were, I think, a sort of very strange on and off relationship with the new Russian power. At the time, someone like Mr. Putin was involved very much in good connections being reorganized between the Russian and new renovated Russian intelligence agencies and the Chinese. And the third part of this has been the cyber attacks, the cyber organizations. It belongs to one major organization within the People's Liberation Army, which we used to call the third department, but now it's been revamped over the last 5 years into a major organization. And they are involved in so many cyber attacks. In fact, I just read this morning that earlier this month, India, the Indian intelligence services have noted that there were special cyber attacks, for instance, directed to Ladakh and border areas between China and India, for instance, one small example. So I should say already the Chinese had major manpower. They're good technical organizations. They're new, renovated, I would say, intelligence agencies, many people, much, it's more powerful than the Russian, the Americans, the French, or the Indian together. I mean, as regards the population. And I know the Indian population is very big, but in terms of intelligence, I don't think it is still matching the Chinese effort.
I'd like, this is fascinating, and I think it would be very helpful for our listeners to go back to the beginnings of your story in your book and look at or begin with the story of Chinese intelligence from the time of the revolution and the formation of the People's Republic of China in the period after 1949. Why did the intelligence services come to have such an important role in the Chinese Republic? Of course, this is, to stick with our Soviet analogy, also was very important for the Soviets with the Chekists and so on in the immediate revolutionary aftermath. But in the Chinese context, what was the importance of the intelligence services to the revolutionary state?
If I may say, sir, if you allow me to say something, last year there was this centenary of the foundation of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921 in Shanghai. Well, obviously, the political aspect was the most important aspect of this venture. But at the same time, it is very important to know that right from the beginning, in 1921, a special intelligence service of the Chinese Communist Party was set up. It was also set up thanks to a giant in history who was Mr. Zhou Enlai. Zhou Enlai was involved in learning things. He was involved in the foundation of the Communist Party here in France, in fact, and in Belgium.
Fascinating.
Yes. And when he went back to China, he was involved in the Shanghai. The Shanghai, as you remember, was a city with various international regions, departments, if you want, districts. The British, the international, and the French. And for instance, the underground Communist Party of China organization was underground in the French part of Shanghai. Because then the nationalist, Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, led later by Mr. Chiang Kai-shek, couldn't go into that concession. It was called a concession, French concession, and arrest people. And so Mr. Zhou Enlai, who later became, as you know, Prime Minister and Foreign Affairs Minister for People's China, were involved in organizing all the revolutionary underground organization. And the Communist Party needed this intelligence service, which was very much helped and organized by the Soviets at that time. So the Soviets, as you said yourself, the Cheka, later called NKVD and KGB later, but also, more importantly, the Communist International and the Military Intelligence Agency, the GRU, which, by the way, was never destroyed and still is active nowadays in Ukraine as we speak right now. A bit different, naturally, more modern, I would say. But Mr. Zhou Enlai and Mr. Kang Sheng was the main leader of the intelligence service. They thought, we must use the old traditions of Chinese spying going back to the ancient times, 1,000 years before the Communist Party existed. Two, we are helped by our comrades from the Soviet intelligence apparatus, Mr. Dzerzhinsky and the others, and Mr. Berzin from the GRU. And also, because we are involved in the French and English concessions, we are going to learn how those people from Europe are organized. And so there was what we used to call the Deuxième Bureau, the second bureau in French intelligence, and intelligence service, and MI6, the British, in the British concessions. And they learned, in fact, there were four traditions melted together. It's very strange the way it was organized. So they were already a very modern, although still small, but as the war went on, the war against the Japanese, and later the civil war against Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, they also were involved very much in intelligence, operational intelligence, as much as economic and propaganda already. I would say psychological operations, which included, for instance, trying to recruit a friend of the wife of the American President Roosevelt, for instance, one small instance. So in fact, they were already a major organization, and also, and this is the most important today, maybe, an organization of security services against the traitors, against the counter-revolutionaries, against the Japanese spies, and all that. That was organized by Mao Zedong and Kangsheng and Zhou Enlai in Yunnan. That is, in the region, they had taken over the free red areas, as they called it. And little by little, when they took over by 1949, as you rightly reminded us, 1949, the People's Republic is set up. They've won over against the Japanese, against the Kuomintang, the nationalists, who fled mostly to Taiwan. Right? Then the first thing was taking over the whole of the country and organizing the People's Security Service, that is the Gongangbu, that is the public security ministry. That is especially to fight against spies, but also to regulate the situation, to arrest people who were supposedly supporters of Chiang Kai-shek, all the various things, people who were trying to oppose themselves to the new communist rule. That was the major organization. And as you know, unfortunately, started to be, you may be an historian and now and again be sad about something, you unfortunately starting to set up the first labor camps, which in China is called Laogai, just like Gulag in Russian. Yeah? And people were sent to those gulags. But after a while, Mr. Zhou Enlai, who was more open-minded because he had been abroad, because he wanted to have a good diplomacy, thought, and for instance, he wanted good relationship with India, for instance, with the non-aligned India at the time. They decided that they should have a new good intelligence service abroad. And they started to set it up. They did start, but unfortunately, this all melted away because occurred the Cultural Revolution by 55, 66. And then there were so many infightings, faction fights within the Communist parties, that even the intelligence services were partly destroyed. Right. Them, So they had to start again, once again, once Mao was dead, Zhou Enlai was dead, Kangsheng died also, all that is the 70s, and Mr. Deng Xiaoping took over, and he said, well, look, we need a new intelligence service really worth of our place in the world.
Well, I'll come to that in just a minute, but I think what in your book, one of the fascinating periods is indeed of the Cultural Revolution, because one sees that many of the wider political struggles in the Chinese Communist Party, the wider struggles in society also reflected themselves in these different intelligence services. Can you describe that a little bit, because you have many fascinating passages in your book about this. But were these different elements of the intelligence service representing different factions of the Chinese state and the power establishment, and how important were they in the Cultural Revolution itself in maintaining political order or enforcing the winning side, if you like, in the Cultural Revolution?
Well, maybe there are 2 points there. One is Zhou Enlai and Mao wanted to put forward the revolution around the world, exactly like their own former advisors from Soviet times when the Comintern, the Communist International, wanted to organize a world revolution around the world, setting up communist parties, organizing strikes and all that. Okay. And during the Cultural Revolution, the man in charge of coordinating the intelligence services, Kangsheng, was both in charge of the intelligence service and security inside, and manipulating various factions, helping to set up the Red Guards, the young people who actually supported Mao, organizing also things like ideological things. Kangsheng was involved in getting the Little Red Book made up. Yes. Ideologies, for instance, the famous Red Book, or just as known as the Bible or anything. And at the same time, Mr. Kangsheng, or Comrade Kangsheng, was in charge of the international department, liaison department of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. And then he went in many other countries and started to organize new communist parties pro-China, pro-Beijing.
And this was even in Africa, in far regions outside China's periphery, correct?
In Africa, in India, in Sri Lanka, in many countries you are interested in, and but also in France. Funnily enough, one specific Marxist-Leninist party, pro-China, was set up by the CIA, the Americans, in Holland.
That's fascinating.
The Americans thought, and the counterintelligence of Holland, of the Dutch country, they thought maybe we are going to set up ourselves a pro-Maoist party. Then those guys will be invited to Beijing, and they would be good spies for us once they are in Beijing. That's something we now know because we have got the archives opened over the last 10 years. So that's very fascinating. But at the same time, in Beijing, in Shanghai, in Guangdong, in all the major cities, there was fight between the former government led by President Liu Shaoqi. Some people say he was a Soviet spy. The Kangsheng Mao said he was a Soviet spy and this and that. Well, he was certainly in favor of a more moderate approach for the leadership of China. So was Deng Xiaoping, who was excluded, the secretary of the party. So there were major fights, including fights between factions of the intelligence service, of the security, of the government, of the people's, the public security ministry. In fact, the minister was arrested and died in jail. Two vice ministers were died in jail. And there was another section called the Intelligence or Information Department of the Central Committee. That was rather led by Mr. Zhou Enlai, whom I mentioned earlier as being major pro-diplomacy, and it was smaller, but once some of the guys involved in that were also arrested, but Zhou Enlai protected them and told Mao, look, I need to have those people, otherwise we will be blind. We know nothing about what was actually happening outside. And especially, we need them for the Vietnam War to know what the Americans are going to do. And we Chinese are starting to organize a first step towards possible negotiations with the Americans. Because now, I forgot to tell you, but you knew all that, now our main enemies, the principal enemies, are the Russians, are the Soviets, and not the Americans anymore. So they have to reorganize. But for a good while, I would say between 66 and 70, until Marshal Lim Piao, the head of the PLA, was expelled, died in dubious circumstances near Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. In fact, the organization, it was a disorganization of the intelligence services. And if I may say so, if you allow me to say that, I am thinking now from various sources I have, that there is something similar at the present time in China, and that is due to something else, another cultural revolution, that's COVID-19.
That's fascinating, yes.
Some sections of the intelligence services have been destroyed because some people are sick. There are also fights on the reasons why the COVID was wrongly, I'm not a physician, so I'm just saying what I get information, but it looks like there are major problems. And the guy, the vice minister in charge of intelligence and security in Wuhan, is a vice minister. That's a very high level position. He was arrested last 1921. He was arrested in March 21 last year for corruption and things. But in fact, most of the things that he didn't do properly what was asked for him to do as regards the policing of Wuhan and the other most important areas as regards COVID-19.
So as a historian of the Chinese intelligence services, again sticking with this period after the détente with the United States, China begins to emerge as an economic power. How would you assess the failures and successes of the Chinese intelligence services? Their own war in Vietnam, after all, they don't do so well. They have not succeeded in that period before the 1980s in destabilizing the government in Taiwan. They've had limited success with India. How would you assess their successes and failures? Because again, you have very interesting sections on their great progress in gathering economic intelligence in that period. Was this a shift of emphasis? Was geopolitics less important for them in this period?
Well, I think geopolitics was important, but they had problems. As you said yourself, it's not so much the Vietnamese war. It was during the Vietnam War, they supported the Red Khmers, the Khmer Rouge, in Cambodia. Right. And it was the wrong horse, if I may say so, to yes. We shouldn't be laughing because it was such a disaster and atrocity for so many people died there, but genocide in Cambodia. But then Deng Xiaoping for a while kept on supporting the Khmer Rouge, and then finally changed altogether and said, okay, we forget about it. The other thing was Afghanistan. It was the first time because the Americans and the Chinese and the Pakistani intelligence services got together more or less, and I forget some of the Saudis and other people, but let's say those three are very important. And the Chinese, with their border at the Karakoram Pass and all that, they did support some Afghan factions. The Taliban didn't exist at the time yet, but they did support people whom we see now back, or their sons and cousins and all that. Like for instance, Gulbuddin Bakhtiar, one of the fundamentalist leader of the Afghan factions, and so many others. And so it was a good time for them because they also exchanged technical knowledge as regards intercept. They had great pairs. Intercept
yes.
on the border of Soviet Union and out by the American. So I wouldn't say it was all that bad for them, but it wasn't as good as naturally they would have liked. But as you say, and you're right on this, Deng Xiaoping said, look, we are going to organize a new opening up of China. It will become major and possibly later on the prime country as regards economic development, which is not that wrong actually. And so we are going to organize the apparatus, and also set up the agencies. For instance, then that a new agency is set up, that is the State Security Ministry, called Guohanbu. I always say Guohanbu will be as famous in the 21st century as KGB used to be in the 20th century. Guohanbu is not that big. It's possibly, I should say, 25, maybe I'd be wrong, so let's say 40,000 officials and officers and all that. But it is politically also an important organization. It's different from the People's Liberation Army. Also, Deng Xiaoping was watching around, and you can read, I mean, many other things were opened. I mean, for us, researching, there's many text, documents, things are just opened. We didn't have internet when I started writing on these issues, but I already had access, even reading some of the Chinese papers. And today, naturally, it's used to be easier, although lately with Mr. Xi Jinping, things are closing down, so it's more difficult for sources. But anyway, Deng Xiaoping said, look, let's look at the Japanese. How do the Japanese do in terms of economic intelligence? And as you know, the Japanese were prime, they were excellent in terms of business intelligence, economic intelligence, all that scientific level. And he looked at what the special Ministry of Economic Research involved in Japan, in Tokyo, and I've been quite often to Japan. Many of my books are translated into Japanese, so I had access to exchanging with people and access to people from China who went to Japan, and also talking to specialists in Japan. And they saw that the Deng Xiaoping by 1984, 85 had set up a new Ministry of Trade with a major section of intelligence and research, which obviously is not just recruiting people within the French Ministry of Economics or the Indian Ministry of Economics. It's also trying to get as many information, try to set up the first computerization of getting intelligence on trade issues, on economics. And that was a major thing. And I would say until, well, unfortunately, a new crisis occurred there again, like the Cultural Revolution. It was 89, the Tiananmen. So here again, you had a new problem. But all the same, the first roots of the new situation were there with Mr. Deng Xiaoping.
One of the things I sometimes think gets lost in these debates on Chinese intelligence is that while they've made very big investments in technology, in computing, in communications intelligence capabilities, to create an intelligence service that could operate in the West and at great distance also involves a very systematic cultivation of or growth of human capability, languages, analytical ability, which intelligence services across the world struggle with. Finding the right people, the right talent. How did the Chinese go about it?
Well, first of all, I forgot to tell you something which I think is very important. I've got good friends among the Chinese community. I want to make it clear. I'm trying to write a clinical history of Chinese intelligence. But as a people, the Chinese are fine. So I know many Chinese students. And because I know many Chinese students, I've noted that by the time Mr. Deng Xiaoping opened China, he also organized a new structure which became bigger and bigger as time went by, was the, first of all, so many students going abroad. Right. Studying abroad and also starting to get foreign students to the country. But it's more, but the population is there to, 1 billion first of all, and also exchange of organizing lots of conferences, both ways in China, and attending so many conferences and all that, and then trying to then not only get informations, but I would say recruit people, but also get micro informations, which you get. I mean, some young students, they are not spies as such. Would be wrong to say they are spies and arrest them and put them in jail and say you are spying on us. But without knowing, in fact, they are going back with informations which then back in China, they are asked to, give to their, some of them don't want that, but then there's pressure on their families and all that. It's very difficult if you are young Chinese students. And lately, over the last 20 years, there has been even further a major organization set up by, under Mr. Hu Jintao, President Hu Jintao, or Mr. Xi Jinping, was the expansion of things such as the Confucius Institutes, for instance.
Right, the language schools.
But if you note, you've seen yourself that some of the institutes are set up exactly where there are major universities of technical importance.
Yes.
Prime importance. In fact, as an Indian person, you know better than me that your security services have been watching very carefully what is actually happening with the Confucius Institutes, and have asked that it would be reduced to only 3 or 4 institutes in Mumbai, in various areas. Because many, for instance, if you take Canada, in Canada, the intelligence services, they are very much and saying it's a cover for spying, which is a bit, well, it's a bit rude to say that, but at the same time, there is, so whatever, it is under the control of the propaganda ministry of the Communist Party of China. So the soft power has been as such important to give a good image of China, but it's also useful because naturally you get so many people you are meeting, you're trying to get more information from them and all that.
A final question, since we regrettably have a deadline on what is a truly fascinating conversation. Sure. We see China today agglomerating colossal amounts of information, developing artificial intelligence capabilities to analyze that information. Yet, as a historian of intelligence, Mr. Faligot, you know that states that have accumulated intelligence are not necessarily efficient consumers of that information. The Stasi famously collapsed despite so many citizens collaborating with it. Going back even to the period of Ottoman intelligence, they were obsessed with intelligence gathering, but could not prevent the disintegration of the Ottoman Caliphate. What is your prediction on Chinese intelligence? I know I'm asking for astrology, not the historian. But will Chinese intelligence succeed in keeping the country, turning the country into a surveillance state that functions efficiently? Or with Shanghai and with COVID, are we seeing a little breakdown of this vision today?
Well, as you know, Chinese love astrology. But yes, I get your point. Let's say, to be short, first of all, the area under Mr. Xi Jinping is really new. Well, it's really, he reorganized the People's Liberation Army with the new, for instance, the Strategic Support Force, which is a new organization with the cyber, military intelligence, all that. That's one thing. But in order to get into power, he had to purge the army with thousands and thousands of officers, of generals being, disposed of. He started by getting arrested the coordinator of intelligence in 2012, Mr. Yong Zhongkang, and many others were put in jail. So it's not that easy to first of all be sure that there aren't new faction fights within the Communist Party, right, and therefore within the intelligence service. I would like to say something special, also that I forgot. So many things that could be said. If you are in the French DGAC, that is the French intelligence service, if you are in the Indian RAO, I'm very fortunate that the former director of RAO is introducing my book, Sir Vikram Sood. So, well, we are in a democratic country, all the same. We may be discussing what our governments are doing now and again. Yesterday we voted for a new president here, but okay. But the thing is, the Chinese are different. If I am a director of the Chinese intelligence service, I'm a director. But there's a second guy, or a woman, a man or a woman, but usually it's a man so far. Just beside me is the political commissar.
Right.
That is when you discuss some intelligence scheme, you say, well, technically, I can put some microphone within the office of the delightful journalist from ThePrint, for instance. But the other guy would say, no, politically, it's a wrong thing. We must be in good terms with India. Don't do that. So it's a different way of, so that's one problem. Second problem, as I said, is faction fight within the Communist Party. And I may say that today I get impression, but I'm sure I would love to exchange with Indian specialists on that as well, and other people. At the moment, because of the COVID situation, in fact, some of the members of the Communist Party, even the higher ranks, are really frightened by what actually Mr. Xi Jinping is doing. And especially so because he used COVID for further repression on things like take Hong Kong, for instance. In Hong Kong, you could have been expecting that it went well smoothly until, but we have seen over the last 2 years, that the security aspect has been tabled. The Shanghai, as we are speaking, there's a difficult situation with the COVID again, and as we see, you see, Xi Jinping thought maybe he thought we don't use as much human intelligence. We use more technical intelligence. With the cyber thing, we are going to go into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of New Delhi or Paris and all that. But in fact, you also need human intelligence. And this is a major problem. So I don't think it's good to have so many, as you say yourself, so many members, officers, intelligence operatives in your organization. But if you don't have a good political, understanding of the world situation, and for instance, of course, they are trying to balance off, for instance, in Ukraine at the moment. Take the Chinese who are on board Chinese intelligence service. They have good relationship with the Russians and with the Ukrainian intelligence service. It's a triangle. So now, at the moment, we are talking now, we are at the end of, almost the end of April, and some of the leaders of the Guangdong are in Kiev, trying to discuss with some of their colleagues from Ukraine and saying, we can go to Moscow after, we can help maybe going towards a peaceful situation.
Fascinating. So find some middle path that will...
And they do the same, for instance, for Afghanistan and Pakistan, a country which is very important for right now. Last week, there were two major, one vice minister and directors of departments of the Guanbu going to Pakistan to discuss, because they don't like the situation, because there started to be a crisis between the Taliban. And the Chinese always were in good terms with the Taliban, always.
Right.
From 92, when they started to really get important. And the Pakistani government, but as you know, there is a crisis also there in Pakistan, so we are not in a very clear situation.
So thank you very, very much, Mr. Faligot, for making the time to join us. I'd like to apologize for hauling you away from your vacation in the countryside.
I'm not in vacation. No, I'm working right now.
And I hope we will have the opportunity to discuss this and other things China in person one of these days. Thank you so much for making the time for this discussion.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.